announcements. You've seen them on the screen, but I think it's worth repeating. During the month of December, our calendar kind of goes a little whack. I think that's true for your personal lives as well. And so a couple of things that normally are routine for Bridgepoint kind of change a little bit in the month of December. So a couple of things to keep in mind. We normally have a study group the first and third Friday of the month. But for December, obviously with the Christmas holidays coming, we will only have one study group meeting. We normally do it in two different homes, but for the month of December, we will just have one study group meeting, and it will be in the San Francisco location at the home of Brother Lando and Sister Rose Dadoy. And so those of you that go to both or one or the other, make sure you show up all together for this one. And sort of an ongoing tradition in that, we've been doing this for many years now, is if you want to, we ask that you come with a gift worth about $10. Don't bring $10, right? Bring a gift that's worth about $10. And we put that all on the table at the end of the Bible study. We just have fun, drawing numbers and fighting over, each other's gifts. And it's always sort of a fun tradition that we have there. And then also, we normally have a couple of fellowship groups all throughout the month. The men have their thing going, the women have their thing going, the couples have their thing going. But then again, for the month of December, we'll just bring everyone together for one fellowship group. And so if you're male, female, or couple, I guess that makes all of you. You're welcome to join us on the 15th in South San Francisco. We'll be sending more information, but we'll be gathering for really our Christmas gathering for the month, and then we'll leave much of the second half of December free for you guys to just enjoy your vacations, hang out with your friends and family, and then we'll go back to, there's no normal in Bridgepoint, but we'll go back to as much of a normalcy as we can in 2019. Isn't that crazy? In 2019, just saying it is mind-boggling, but that's how time flies. All right, so again, keep in touch with what's going on, especially online. But today I'd like to draw your attention to the Gospel of Luke. Go ahead and open in Luke chapter 1, and then let me explain to you what will be going on in the next couple of weeks. But before I do that, I'd like to give you a Christmas tip that you may or may not use, but it's up to you. People ask me all the time, well, biblically speaking, what's the best way to prepare for Christmas or the holidays? So let me share with you what I think is one of the better ones that I'm aware of. We celebrate in our culture Christmas, or the birth of Christ, on December 25. That means there are 24 days in December before we celebrate the Christmas holiday. And the Gospel of Luke is made up of 24 chapters. And so what I often tell people is, starting December 1, we're a little late. You should have started yesterday, but you can still catch up today. What I normally tell people is read one chapter of Luke every day from December 1 to December 24. Right? So today you need to read chapter 1 and 2, because we're already in the second. But starting tomorrow, on the 3rd, read chapter 3, and the 4th, read chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 24. When Christmas Day comes, you would have read the story of the life of Jesus. And you would have fully understood what that holiday is all about, because you would have learned about his birth, his life, his ministry, his death, and resurrection. You like that? So you still have time. You can do chapter 1 and 2 tonight before you go to sleep. And then starting tomorrow, just read a chapter a day. And it will change totally your perspective of waking up on Christmas morning having learned within 24 days the story of the life of Jesus. So that was free, no charge. That's free advice. But today, Luke is where we're going to start. And I'm going to get you started actually with a few chapters reading from chapter 1. So as we prepare to learn the lesson of Luke chapter 1, let me begin with a word of prayer. Our God, today we thank you that as our mind is drawn to the teaching of your word and what we can learn about the gift of Jesus Christ, would you open our understanding and grant to us the gifts that we need to fully absorb, to ingest, to digest, and to appreciate the truth of the Scriptures. And Holy Spirit, grant to us not only the filling of our mind, but the empowerment of our being, so that whatever truth we learn, we get to live it out in a way that brings you glory. In Jesus' name, amen. Let me explain to you where I'm going to go from this day onward, leading to really the rest of this month. You know, when I was a child, my mom would just take my brother and I to almost wherever it is she would go. My mom was chauffeur, and you know, if she had a business meeting, she'd pick us up from school. We'd still go to the business meeting, sit somewhere, you know, and this, that. My mom just took us everywhere when we were young. And one of the places Mom would take us was birthday parties. So, you know, my mom was a very social being. She's a social butterfly. And so she gets invited to all kinds of things, and we would just go along. And I remember just going to all kinds of parties, homes, big homes, small homes, businesses, you know, schools, wherever. And wherever we would go to a party, we'd just celebrate, we'd eat, we'd drink, you know, like soda, right? You know, as a kid. But just enjoy the party. And then I remember many times, you know, just getting back in the car, driving home, and I go, Mom, that was a really good party, and that food is really good. And my mom's like, yeah, I'm glad you liked it. And I'm like, whose birthday was that, Mom? Like, who was that? Why were we there? And I just remember asking that question so many times. And I realized I've been to so many parties as a child where I had no clue whose party it was. I mean, I enjoyed the food, I made the most of the celebration, I got to meet people, but I just didn't know whose birthday it was. And the reason I tell that story is because I fear that in our culture, that's how many people celebrate Christmas. We're all invited, whether you like it or not. You know, the holidays are upon us. Every mall is decorated, every restaurant has a feature in their menu, every store has sort of a special. And so we celebrate this season, this holiday, and we participate in it. You know, we make merry, we shop, we do this. And the weirdest part, by the way, of Christmas is asking for gifts, right? Asking for gifts. I remember hearing a conversation between a mom and her daughter, and Mom said, Mom, what gift will I have this Christmas? What gift? And he's like, why? What is Christmas? Is it your birthday? No, it's Jesus' birthday. Then why should I give you a gift? You should give Jesus a gift. You know, so one of the smartest moms I've ever met. But my fear is that as we celebrate the holidays and eat the food and make merry, I wonder how many of us at the end of the year, leading to a new year, look back and go, that was an incredible holiday, wasn't it? And then you go, well, what was that all about? Like, what were we celebrating? Or worse, who was that holiday for? Very often, we, as a nation, as a society, as a culture, celebrate things that we don't understand. Now, over that is even another layer that makes it more complicated, in that the way we celebrate the event is sort of piled one layer above the other with traditions and things and folklore and belief that may have had nothing to do with the original occurrence that we are remembering. You know, for instance, there's a lot of debate on why we even celebrate the birth of Christ in December 25. There is almost a 99.99% sort of probability that it was not on December 25. December 25 is rather historically random. You know, first of all, the Bible nowhere tells us when exactly Jesus was born. Secondly, the early church did not even celebrate the birth of Jesus at all. The early church celebrated the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That was sort of the focal point of the life of Christ, and they really didn't bother much with his birth and all that stuff. So it was much, much later. And then it's really coupled with many other things: Santa Claus, reindeer, trees, lights, shopping, etc., ham. I mean, my goodness, the guy's birthday, the guy having a birthday is Jewish, and ham's not kosher, and yet we serve ham on his birthday, right? And so when you look at the fact that it's so ingrained in our culture to celebrate this holiday, plus there's layers and layers of stuff that's kind of piled over it, it makes you wonder how true to the event are we really honoring the reason for which we are supposedly celebrating. And I felt that the best way, at least for me, to do it as your pastor and as a church, is to kind of, let's just remove all the layers. Let's let society do what it does, and let's let the malls do their work. But here in this church, let's remove all of those layers, and let's go to the original document. Let's go to the first-hand documentation of what this is all about, and let's see what we can learn. And if it offends your cultural sensibilities, you may have to kind of dispense with that for the sake of saying, well, this is what it really should be all about. Now, let me explain to you why I'm going to Luke, since we have 4 Gospels to choose from. I chose Luke for our sermons this month because of all the Gospels that are available in the Bible. Luke really is the one who took the time to give us the most detail with regards to the beginnings of the life of Jesus. Matthew tells a few stories about Joseph's vision and the wise men. John tells it from a more cosmic perspective. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. So that's very, that's awesome, but it's very cosmic. It's not very Christmassy. Mark says nothing about the birth of Jesus. Mark says, once upon a time there was a guy named John, and he announced that Jesus was here. He says nothing. But when you go to Luke, Luke is very different. Luke begins with a very slow telling of how this story begins. And he gives us the most detail. So I felt that Luke is where we should kind of hover for the next couple of Sundays leading to our Christmas service. And Luke chapter 1 is a good place to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about something that we often forget is connected to the Jesus, quote, Christmas story, but we tend to bypass it very quickly in order to get to the whole Mary and Joseph thing. And today I'd like to talk about the birth of Jesus' cousin, John. Jesus had a cousin by the name of John. Some people think his family name was the Baptist. That's not really his last name. The Baptist is a description of what he did. He was John who immersed people in water. That's really all it means. But his name is John. And the story in the New Testament of the Christ event actually begins with him rather than with Jesus. And it's important to know his place in the story. So let me read portions of Luke. I'll kind of give you a running commentary as I read, and then at the end of this I'll extract, I think, its most important lessons. But let me read the first 4 verses of Luke chapter 1, because here Luke explains to us why he's even writing. And he begins, and this is the English Standard Version, by saying this: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered to them, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." Luke is the most different for this reason. Most of the Bible, at least the Gospels, Matthew and John in particular, were written by people who actually lived with Jesus for some time. They were active disciples for Jesus' 3 years of ministry, and then after Jesus died and rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, they went on to become the great apostles of the church. Luke, however, is not distinguished among those people. Luke is more of sort of a later Gentile convert who comes to Christ likely after the whole event of Jesus' life. So he comes into the picture later. He was not there to be a personal witness to Jesus. He was not an original follower of Jesus Christ. He's sort of a late bloomer in this whole unfolding of history. And so that makes him unique. Luke, by profession, is actually a doctor. Paul refers to him in the letter as the physician Luke. Luke is a doctor. It's why many hospitals are called St. Luke's Hospital, because he's associated with the practice of medicine. And being a doctor, he was probably, other than Paul, he's probably the most educated writer of the New Testament. You know, most of the writers of the New Testament were fishermen and tax collectors, or you know, just people with very basic grammar education as a Jewish boy. Whereas Luke went to school, and he's very well versed in the language of medicine and of science, but he's also a man of faith. And you can imagine that being a late bloomer into the Christian movement, he's probably curious about a lot of things, but his curiosity caused him, interestingly, to probably end up being more knowledgeable because he was a late bloomer. And think of it this way. How many of you were not citizens of the United States, but are now citizens of the United States? Okay, so you went to how many of you are natural-born Americans? Okay. Those of us, and I went through a process, those of us that became naturalized Americans had to go through a process where we had to prove to the U.S. government that we knew something about America, its history, its civic life, and how it works before we could be welcomed as citizens. And so we end up reading things. I remember I read the entire Constitution cover to cover. Most people don't even do this, but I did. And I read history, and I studied the books. And I was once having a chat with a friend of mine, a student of mine, and I said, I didn't know much about, I was reading about this, and I discovered this, that. I was telling him all about U.S. history and civics and government. And he's like, oh, really? Like, I didn't know that. And I go, wait a minute, you're an American. Like, you were born here. This is your country. And he goes, yeah, but I just never bothered to learn all about that stuff. And what I discovered is those of us that have to work our way to become Americans end up sometimes learning more about this country than those people who take it for granted because it's how they live. And Luke is like that. Because he's a late bloomer and he wasn't part of the original apostles. In order for him to catch up, he did a lot of work. He talked to people, he interviewed people, he researched, he has a scholar himself, as a scientist himself, went to so many sources to try to come up with that. So when you look at his introduction, he says, this is what I decided. I decided to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. In other words, I want to try to do what other people have done. And what other people have done is possibly a reference to the other Gospels, is that other people have written about the life of Christ also, but I want to do the same, but I want to do it from a different perspective. Now, I'm not sure about Matthew and John, but we're pretty sure that Mark was already written by the time Luke is writing this. Okay, so Mark is possibly the earliest of the Gospels, and then Luke is going to use whatever Mark provides, but he's going to build on that. As you notice, Mark is the shortest Gospel with only about 16 chapters. Luke is among the longer ones with 24. Matthew has more, but 24 is up there. So what Luke is going to do is he's going to take the data that's already been written about Christ, but he says, let me see what else I can gather. And then let me write an account. Let me tell you what I think this story is all about. And he's very specific about who he is writing to. He says, I am writing to you an orderly account, O most excellent Theophilus. So the original reader of this book, this gospel, the original intended reader of this is a man by the name of Theophilus. Theophilus simply means a lover of God. Theos is God. Phileo means, to have affection for, to love. A friend of God, a lover of God. Now, why is Luke writing to Theophilus? Why doesn't he just write to the whole church? Or why doesn't he write to anyone or everyone that wants to read it? Well, most likely he really wrote the gospel for everyone, right? Primarily a Gentile audience, but pretty much everyone. So why does he write Theophilus here? Many believe that Theophilus was the patron or sponsor of the writing of this. You know, if you're an author in the ancient world, publication was expensive. And so usually a rich person would sponsor you. Say, oh, Anna, you want to write a cookbook? I'll pay for it. You know, write it, I'll pay for it. So in exchange for the courtesy, the book would be dedicated to the person who paid for its production. So most likely this person, Theophilus, is the patron or the sponsor of the book. In fact, Luke refers to him as the most excellent Theophilus. The most excellent is usually an indication that he is either royal or he is important in civic life. So he could be like a government official or someone who's kind of a prominent person, and that would explain wealth, and that would explain his place. And so Theophilus is this. By the way, you may not have caught this yet, but when he writes Acts later on, he will also dedicate Acts to Theophilus. It's right there in the opening verses. So Theophilus was an active part of the writing of Luke and the writing of Acts because, by the way, Luke and Acts are really one story. They need to be read one after the other. So that's why he wrote it, and that's why we have this. It then explains to us why we have all this detail. Stuff that Mark didn't write about, Matthew didn't write about, John didn't write about. Luke is writing about it because he's actually got more data than all those other guys. Right? And later on, next week we'll go into this, Luke is the one who tells us that Mary got an announcement, and he tells us that they traveled to Bethlehem, and he tells us that there was a census and that shepherds show up. How did Luke know all about that? How come Matthew never tells this to us? John never mentions it. Mark doesn't even bring it up because of his sources. So who are his sources? Believe it or not, and many scholars agree on this, that Luke actually is believed to have sat down with Mary herself and said, Mary, tell me what happened. Tell me what happened. You were there. And so Mary is believed to be the source of the early part of this book. And what better person to ask, right, about the early life of a person than mom? I mean, you want to find out about our kids, talk to Anna, right? She'll tell you bizarre things, interesting things, embarrassing things, but she has the story. And so this story, we believe, is provided to Luke, most likely from Mary and other family members who were close. So let me go to the opening story, which is interesting that he doesn't go to Jesus, but he goes to a couple by the name of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And I'll read most of this so that you'll hear it the way Luke intended. In verse 5, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest by the name of Zechariah, of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both religious before God, walking blameless in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren and both were advanced in years. So this is the opening. We're introduced to two people, a man by the name of Zechariah. What do we know about Zechariah? He's a priest. He's married to a woman by the name of Elizabeth. What do we know about Elizabeth? She is from the line of Aaron, who is the high priest during the time of Moses. So this is a priestly family. In other words, this is a ministry family. This is like the Missionaries, right? Their life is all about ministry. That's what they do for a living. They're in the religious industry, if you will. And Zechariah was a priest in the temple, and his wife comes from a priestly line. And what do we know about their character? Luke will take time to say they were righteous before God, walking blameless in all the commands of the Lord. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that they were sinless, for no one is sinless but God, right? But what it means that in their behavior, in their character, they were upright people. They were the kinds of people you would love to have in your community, in your church, in your synagogue. But right after he says they were upright people, it says, but they had no child, for Elizabeth was barren. I want you to learn this lesson very quickly. That it is possible to walk right with God and still have stuff in your life not work. Did you get that? It is possible to walk in righteousness and still have something in your life that isn't right. That's very important. Because some of us somehow believe that if we do everything right in the eyes of God, our life should be perfect. And therefore we say, God, why am I going through this? I go to church. God, why is this happening to me? I give an offering every Sunday. God, why are you allowing me to go through this? I feed the poor. I serve in community. And sometimes we have this warped understanding that just because we're living a righteous life, that nothing should be wrong in our life. And yet we see here an amazing couple by the name of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and they're upright, righteous in the eyes of God, but they're barren. And if you haven't caught this yet in any of my sermons, you will understand this, that nothing could be worse for a woman in the ancient world than to not be able to have a child. Remember this. Remember, in the ancient world, as it still can seem today, it was such a disadvantage to be a woman. You know, being a man, that was what you wanted, right? Because men were leaders, men were prominent, men had power. Women were considered weak. Sometimes they weren't even considered equal to men. But the one thing a woman can do that a man could never do is have children. And having children was the one power women had that no man could challenge her on. It was her kind of badge of honor. And so when a woman in the ancient world could not have kids, that meant she had nothing. Because number one, she was a woman, which was already bad enough, but she didn't have the one thing a woman had over a man, which was the ability to have children, and so that was gone. So when you look at all the barren women in Scripture, Rachel and Rebecca, and then now we see Elizabeth, we see that they're distraught. And not only is she barren, it says here that both of them were advanced in years. We don't know how old. Some scholars say 50s, which is painful that for someone to say 50s is old. 50s possibly inching up in their 60s. So even by today's standards, that you wouldn't expect a woman at that age to give birth. But yet they are in the temple and they're serving. And no matter what is wrong or not happening in their life, isn't it amazing that they're still found in love with God and serving Him? Have you ever allowed what's not right in your life to keep you from truly loving the Lord with all of your heart? I didn't get what I prayed for, so I'm not going to church this Sunday. Right? Or that didn't happen, so I'm not doing the Bible study thing anymore. I'm not going to read my Bible, I'm not going to pray, I'm not going to do. How many of us are kids when it comes to spiritual things? God won't give me what I want, so I'm not going to give Him what He asks. And yet here you see an elderly couple who are longing for a child, but even though God has not opened their womb, they are still found in the temple, giving God the worship that He deserves and the service that He deserves. But something important happens in verse 8. It says, "Now while he was serving as a priest before God, his division was on duty according to the custom of the priesthood. And he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and to burn incense." See, if you were a priest back in the day, and by the way, he would have been one of literally thousands of priests. Your job was to do whatever was needed in the temple. If you needed to prepare an animal for the priest, the high priest to sacrifice, that was your job. If you needed to clean the altar, that was your job. If you needed to light some of the candles in the temple, you had to be a priest in order to do that. Lay people were not allowed to do these, high religious things. But what's interesting in this story is that his division, see the priests, there was an estimated, the number I heard was maybe 18,000 priests in Israel at that time. And they were all broken down into divisions. So you belong to sort of a division of priesthood. And it happened to be the time when Zechariah's division was on duty. But since there's so many of them, how do they decide which of us in this division goes in the temple? Because you can only go one at a time and you have to be really prepared for it. So what they would do is they would draw lots. And so they drew lots, and what name came? Zechariah. You may not appreciate this, but here's the thing. In a priest's lifetime, there's a chance you might not even have your name drawn. There are so many priests. It's like Charles Barkley. All those years in the NBA, but no championship. Right? You can actually have a career in the NBA and never win a championship. Right? So you could actually be a priest in those days and never enter the temple. And on the event that your name gets chosen, that is the only time in your life that you will ever do this. Because once your name is chosen, let's give everyone else a chance. So you were lucky enough to even be chosen once, and if you did it once, that's the only time for the rest of your life you will ever do it. This is a one-shot deal. So the question is, of all the years that Zechariah was waiting, maybe this year it's my turn, maybe they'll pick my name, and he did this for years and years and years and years and years, and now that he's old, he's like, well, maybe I'll just die, right? And then finally, they draw lots, and his name is chosen. He's like, wow, this is the only time before I die that I will ever go to the temple and administer the duties of a priest. And so he goes. And the whole multitude of people were praying outside as Zechariah entered the temple. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. So when Zechariah entered the temple, an angel appeared. Now, this is not in the job description. It doesn't say enter the temple, bring fire, and you're going to see an angel. That wasn't there. His job was just to light the room, right? And when he goes there, there's an angel. And when you don't expect someone to show up, what is your response? Fear, right? Have you ever gone to a room thinking you're the only person in that room? Right? You're in a room there, ah! Right? I mean, it's never like, oh, right? It's like, what in the world? It's total fear. So you can imagine, he thinks he's the only guy in the temple inside. Everyone's outside, because everyone's praying outside. He thinks, dude, this is my room, this is my time, my name got picked, I'll never do this again for the rest of my life. This is my moment, I'm in the temple. And then suddenly an angel of the Lord shows up, and he's like gripped with fear. Not expected, right? And then Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, but the angel said, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. What prayer? There's nothing mention of a prayer here. His job is to light the inside of the temple. He's not praying necessarily, that we're told. But then the angel says, your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. Oh, that prayer. Well, how long have they been praying that? Well, if they're 60, and they got married at 18, and in the ancient world, they weren't like 21st century millennials, right? 21st century millennials says, I'll get married at 35, and I'll have my first kid at 50. At least that's how it seems these days, right? They wait to get married, and then they wait to have children, right? Imagine that generation sending their kids off to college. Don't waste my social security. But in the ancient world, you got married early. Women were like 14, 15, right? Men were like 16, 18. And as soon as you got married, you had kids. That's it, right? Which explains the modern phenomenon of why when you get married and still don't have kids, the older generation will inevitably ask, when are you going to have kids? Anak, you got married 3 years ago, okay? When are you going to have kids? Where did that whole phenomenon come from? That came from an understanding for most of human history that when you get married, you have children. Right? It's a given. No one I know in the ancient world said, we're going to get married, but no kids. What? What? Right? It's a given. So if Zechariah was 18 when he got, and I'm just making this up, I don't know if he got married at 18. But if he was married when, 18 at marriage, and he's about 60 now, that's how long he's been praying for a child. How long have you been praying for what you've been praying and you're getting impatient? This guy has been praying through his 20s. He said, maybe my wife and I are in the 20s, we're vibrant, we're ready, Lord. And the 20s go, and now the 30s. 30s, wait about. That's the Hebrew for can be. Wait about. Right? Even the 30s. And they can imagine the 30s going by and they have no child going, okay, I guess 40's still okay. I mean, okay, let's keep praying. Right? And then the 50s, can you imagine a 50 like, Lord, lead us to an adoption agency. I don't know what he's praying at this point, but it's like they still want the child, and they don't want to give up hope because they're people of faith, but it's starting to look like it's not going to work. Are you praying for something right now and it doesn't look like it's going to happen? Are you praying for something right now and you go, okay, I don't know, God, like, I was pretty cool 10 years ago praying about it, but now it's kind of like, and we do wane in our faith, don't we? But isn't it interesting that Zechariah in his old age is in the temple serving, and the angel says, your prayer will be answered. In other words, it was still in his heart. It was still something they were longing for. It was still something they were wanting, even if it was losing sense. And he says, your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. And here's how specific it is. You will name him, and he gives him a name. Now, the name in the English Bible is John. You will name him John. But there's no John in Hebrew nor in Greek. It is the name Yahan. And you will name your son Yahan. Yah is from Yahweh. Right? Yahan. Han is from the word for grace and gift. Right? So Yahan or John, in fact Jonathan is the derivative of John. John means the Lord gives. The Lord graciously gives. Isn't that the perfect name for Elizabeth's kid? Right? Because she's like, I want a kid. I want a baby. Please give me a baby. Please bless me with a baby. And then the baby's name will be the Lord has graciously given. His name is John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, and he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink. And listen to this, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even in his mother's womb. Filled with the Holy Spirit even in the womb. Wow, so even if the baby's in the womb, that's a real person, isn't it? It's a human being that God can fill and God can use. Because even in his mother's womb, he was already a child with destiny. By the way, my opinion is, every child in the womb is a child with destiny. And we see how they are valued in the scripture like this. And then there's a prophecy about what he will be. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in spirit and in power of Elijah. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, and make ready for the Lord a people prepared. Then it turns to Zechariah and says, and Zechariah said to the angel, how shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. Seems like an innocent question. Look at how the angel responds. The angel says, my name is Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. So the statement that seemed innocent enough, when Zechariah said, how will I know this, for my wife and I are old, was not an innocent inquiry, it was doubt. It was disbelief. He did not believe what the angel said to him, which is very different from other stories in the Bible, isn't it? Because, when Abraham was told, your wife Sarah will give birth, there was a little bit of a chuckle. right? But they were okay. God did something. And then in the coming weeks, we'll learn about Mary and Gabriel. Gabriel's very busy in Luke, by the way. You know, he'll show up to Mary and say, you will be with child. And Mary also says, how will this be? But what we learn in those cases, it wasn't doubt, it was simply an honest inquiry. How's God going to do this? But in Zechariah's case, it was doubt. Like, in other words, this can't happen. I'm old, my wife is old, her womb is like, it's closed, so it's not going to happen. And the angel said, well, because you did not believe, I will shut your mouth. I will shut your mouth. And he became mute on the spot. By the way, we're going to learn later that he probably became deaf too. Because when the people were trying to communicate to him, they had to use like signs. You see, when you live in doubt, you have nothing worth saying. You hear that? We only need to hear from people of faith. People of doubt have nothing worth saying. And you live your lives in the office and at home and in the streets and in the schools, and you're constantly listening to people who doubt, and it's bringing you down. And God said, when there's no faith in your heart, then your mouth is better off closed. You do better for the world by not saying anything than to say something that is doubtful of what God has promised. And so the temporary punishment, if you will, upon Zechariah is he was not able to speak. So the people were waiting outside, wondering what was happening because he had been delayed. After all, how long will it take to light a candle and go out? But Zechariah was taking a bit of his time. They were probably worried, maybe he died. You know, the belief was in those days that if you died with an unrighteous heart, or if you walked into the temple with an unrighteous heart, you would die on the spot. And so maybe some people are saying, maybe he's dead. You know, we don't hear anything. But then he came out, but they saw that he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service ended, they went home. And after these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden. For 5 months she didn't let anyone in that she was pregnant. I don't know why. Maybe she was cautious. You know how I've met women who have gone through this, you know, like especially women who have trouble getting pregnant. And sometimes the first pregnancy didn't work, and the second pregnancy didn't work, and sometimes they get pregnant and go, let's not talk about this one, right? Let's see first. So I don't know if Elizabeth was like, hey, let's not jinx this. Let's see if it's happening. So for 5 months, she kept her pregnancy to herself. But she said in her heart to the Lord has done for me the days when he looked on me and has taken away my reproach among the people. He has removed my shame, in other words. Now I'm going to jump, because Luke will interject the Mary story, which we're going to look at next week. And let me jump to verse 57, where the Zechariah story then continues. Now the time for Elizabeth to give birth had come, and she gave birth to a son. So this is 9 months after the story we just read. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy on her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called the child Zechariah because that was his father's name. You know, the tradition back in the day is you named your son after some relative. A dad, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, right? And to kind of keep the name going. And some of you are like that. You're like a junior or the third or whatever. I'm Eduardo. That's my grandfather's name, and that's my great-grandfather's name. So, you know, sometimes you pull names from your ancestral past. But then the mother said, this Elizabeth, no, his name will be Yahan. Not Zechariah. His name will be Yahan. Why? Because I'm sure Zechariah had communicated with her in the 9 months. The angel said, that's the name, that's the name. Then they said to her, none of your relatives are called by that name. So they made signs to the father. This is our clue that Zechariah was also deaf, not only mute. Because they had to sign to him. Right? Because when somebody's just mute but they can hear, you can always say, hey, I have a question for you. Right? You don't have to say, hey, I have a question for you. Right? Because they can hear, right? But in this case, they had to sign because obviously he had lost the ability to hear as well. And then Zechariah asked for a writing tablet. This is interesting. I've seen pictures of this. You know, a writing tablet back in the day. Remember the magic slate when we were growing up? So a tablet back in the day was not tablet, right? It was just like wood with like clay mud over it, so that you can literally mark on it, and then you can flatten the mud again. It's like the original iPad, right? Is what it was. So he asked for one, and on the tablet he wrote, "His name is Yahan." His name is Yahan. And they all wondered, but immediately the mouth of Zechariah was opened, and his tongue came loose, and he spoke blessings to God. He learned his lesson, right? The reason his mouth was shut is because he had acted in disbelief, so his first words better be words of faith. And by the way, from this point on, I bet you, and I'm not a betting man, but I bet you, that from that day on, every word from Zechariah's mouth was a word of faith. Because he now knew. You know, some of y'all need to be quiet until you're ready to believe. That's my lesson to you. Some of you should not say anything. You should stop posting on social media. You should stop sending emails. You should stop doing anything unless you're ready to truly believe and say something worth saying. Because otherwise you're just bringing yourself and everybody down. Just ask a person, go to your office, how are you today? Well, that's a bad sign, right? When you ask them, well, how are you today? And shut up. Right? No, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I'll ask you again tomorrow. Because you don't need in your life people speaking those kinds of words to you, because it ruins you. All the news and the announcements and things that are not good for you are not worth listening to. And so when his mouth was opened, it was praise to God. Fear came upon all the people. Fear meaning sort of reverence and awe. And the news spread throughout all the hill country of Judea, and all who heard them laid upon their hearts, saying, "What will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with him." I'm running out of time, but let me give you quick lessons on what we learned from this. I want to put myself in Zechariah's shoes or sandals and ask myself, what did Zechariah learn from this whole story, this whole experience? And I came up at least with 3 lessons. I came up, by the way, with like, in my preparation, like 12 lessons, but you guys want to go, so I'll give you 3. The first lesson is, God's hearing is fine. God's hearing is fine. There's nothing wrong with God's hearing. Because we pray like there is. The Lord, just Lord, Father God. Pero Jacob, who else? I'm trying to think. God, you, Lord, Yahweh Adonai. Yahweh Nisi. Yahweh this, Yahweh that. You ever talk to God like He's deaf? Because for some reason you've convinced yourself that He's not really listening to you. And you've lived your life convinced that because of what you've prayed and what you've asked and what you've begged and what you've sort of longed for, you don't see an instantaneous response, and you've just come to this place where you go, I guess God is, one of the titles of God in the Bible is He's the Ancient of Days. You know what that literally means in Hebrew? The Old One. The Old One. And sometimes we think God's ears are so old that He can't hear us anymore. And we've lived our life convinced that God has not heard. But the truth of the matter is, He heard Zechariah and Elizabeth when they were teenagers. He heard them in their 20s, and He heard them in their 30s and 40s and 50s. He's heard all this time. There's nothing wrong with His hearing. That's why when the right time came, the messenger said, God heard your prayer. When did He hear it? Not just now, but even when you started praying. And never get tired of praying a prayer of faith based on a promise of God, because God is hearing it. Just because God's not saying, yeah, okay. God doesn't have to do that. Sometimes we need those those fillers to make sure, right? Have you ever talked to someone and they don't go, mm-hmm, right? And you're talking and go, hey, can you hear me? Were you listening? Were you listening? Yes. No, say what I just said. Say what I just said. Say it. Does that sound familiar? Married people? When you say something to God, you don't say, did you get that? Did you hear that? Because God hears. And He's aware. And you don't have to bug Him, and you just have to continue believing in faith. Lesson number 2, His plans have purpose. His plans have purpose. And I'm going to tie it with the third lesson that I came up with. That His timing is impeccable. God's timing is impeccable. What if they drew lots a month ago? Then it wouldn't have been Zechariah's name. It would be another division of priests, right? It had to be this. It had to be now. And of all the names in the pot or whatever they used, it wasn't, it wasn't Moshe, it wasn't Isaiah, it wasn't Jeremiah, it was Zechariah's name. The timing of everything. And Elizabeth didn't get pregnant last month or 5 years ago or maybe later. It was really with the timing of what Mary would then listen to soon after. And the birth of John and the birth of Jesus would come just at the right time, where John would be about 6 months older than his cousin. And then John would pave the way because that was his job. And everything happens for the right time, the right reason. And we need to stop being impatient. Ever go to a wedding and you're table number 8 at the reception, right? You know where I'm going with this. And then they go, okay, we're going to start the buffet line. And I think there's 15 tables. So we're going to do table 115, 214, 313. You're table 8. We're going to be last! But you know what? Everyone will get fed. But if we don't do it this way, there will be chaos. Right? So it's like airplanes. Ever land in the tarmac? Right? And then you pull into the thing and the tube's there and you can see through the window and you're already practicing it. The thing is, there's 300 people in the plane. And they're all like, you're practicing in your mind. In your mind. And then you hear, ding! And then what do you do for the next 10 minutes? Stand there! You know, when I fly alone, because I'm with someone and go, Ed, get the bag down. When I fly alone, I literally sit there, and when it goes ding, I sit there, right? And I'm like, I don't loosen it big. That's it. As far as I go, right? I loosen it, I click it a little bit, and check my phone to see. And everything was like chaotic. And a couple of people go. I'm there, and when I look around, there's almost no one, and I stand up, and I get my bag, and I walk, and I go to baggage claim. Guess who's there in baggage claim? Everyone who rushed ahead of me. And they're like, and they're like, and my bag comes along with everyone else's, and I'm out of there. You know what? Timing, folks. You don't always have to be the first. It doesn't always have to happen to you when you want. It'll happen when it happens. Because the airlines don't plan their policies around you. They don't say, oh my goodness, June and Ella need to get out really fast. So where do we sit them and where? They don't plan things like that. You're passenger number 27, that's all they care. They're trying to get a movement going and you're part of it. Have you ever complained about traffic? Well, you're traffic. Right? Because the person next to you in this car and that car and that car and the other, they're traffic. But how do they look at you? You're traffic too. It's not that there's traffic around me. We are traffic. We are traffic because the flow of the movement of cars in the freeway isn't about me. And life doesn't happen just because you want it to happen the way you desire for it to happen. It'll happen according to God's plan, and it'll happen according to God's timing. And although Zechariah and Elizabeth wanted kids at 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, God's plan is they had to have it later in life because that's what fit His plan. Because life is not about you. Which is probably the most important lesson you're taking home today. It's not about you. That whatever happens in life, you look to the heavens and you say, God, show me what you are doing, so that I will understand my place in it. I've gone too long. Some of you are praying for something, just like Elizabeth and Zechariah, and you're impatient, and you're losing faith, and you're losing hope, and you are going to go to Costco this week to buy God hearing aids because you're convinced that he's lost his hearing. And this morning God has reminded us he has not. He heard it day one. Remember this whole problem thing? God knew what you were going to need before you even knew you were going to need it. But it is within his plan and his timing to bring it to fruition as he wills, because that's how it works. And what you need to do today is breathe normally, live your life as a righteous person, accept that not everything is going to be okay every day you live, but that God is still in control. And if you can live that way for the rest of your life, then the lesson of Zechariah and Elizabeth are properly learned today. I want you to bow your heads. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to bring to memory whatever it is you've been longing for, just like Zechariah and Elizabeth. Maybe you're longing for a healing that doesn't seem to happen, or a need that just hasn't shown up yet, or a provision, or a promotion, or a relationship, or a blessing that never seems to materialize. And I want you to understand that God has been aware of that. And God already has a plan for that. And He knows the right way to make it happen, and He knows the right time to bring it to happen. And just like Zechariah and Elizabeth, just remain faithful. Just walk upright in His ways. Just live in a way that is pleasing to Him, even if not everything is well. And know that He is honored by that. And that He will honor you back. And He will bring to you, just like He brought to Elizabeth and Zechariah, a son like no other. For second to Christ, perhaps the greatest child born would have been John himself, the one who prepared the way for the Messiah. Today I want to challenge you to continue living in faith. I know it's hard, and I know that there are days when you just want to quit. But I want to challenge you today to keep believing, keep trusting, keep speaking your prayer in faith, and believe that it reaches a gracious ear and a powerful God. A God who is good in all things and is great in His being. And the first lesson we learn in this Christmas season is that it's all about God. And that's all it needs to be. Father, we thank You for the message today. We thank You for how it has spoken to each and every one of us. And we pray, oh God, that You have strengthened in us in our time of study the faith that You have put in our hearts, and we continue to demonstrate in prayer and in praise and in service before You. I pray for anyone in this room right now who is struggling with a prayer, who is struggling with a need, who is on the verge of giving up on faith. And I pray that today we have the nudge that we needed to keep believing you, to keep trusting you, and to acknowledge that you are great and you are good and you are able, and you're able to make a barren womb whole. And you can take anything in my life and make it right once again. Begin with me. Begin with my mind and my heart. Transform me. And then use me. Not only to serve you in love, but to serve people around me so that they might know the gracious gift of Christ. In Jesus' name I pray.